1938. Germany has built an army designed to conquer a continent in weeks. It has almost no fuel to run it, no real oil fields, no reserves worth mentioning. A war machine sitting on empty, 6,000 miles from the one place on Earth pumping enough crude to fill it 3 times over. Texas, sitting on top of an empire John D. Rockefeller built decades earlier. Here's what history rarely mentions. The exact technology that let Germany manufacture its way around that problem didn't come from a German laboratory working in isolation. It came from a $35 million deal with Rockefeller's own oil company. Signed years before Hitler ever took power, we're going to trace exactly how that deal was made, how it quietly powered a war machine, and how it ended with a US senator calling one of America's largest corporations something far more serious than careless. He called it treason. Let's start with the number that made Germany's entire war plan a gamble from day one. By 1936, German industry was burning through 5 million tons of liquid fuel every year, nearly 70% of it imported from outside the country's own borders. Think about what that actually means. A regime built its entire public identity around strength and self-sufficiency, and the fuel keeping its factories and its military running came almost entirely from someone else's ground. That dependence wasn't just inconvenient. It was a single point of failure. One naval blockade, and the entire operation stalls. By 1938, domestic crude production inside German territory, even after absorbing Austria, barely cleared 4 million barrels for the whole year. A fraction of what peacetime needs required, let alone a war fought on multiple fronts. Germany's planners reached the only conclusion left available to them. If the ground wouldn't give them oil, they'd have to manufacture it out of something they actually had in abundance: coal. Here's where the story gets genuinely strange, because the science behind this wasn't new. It had been sitting mostly unused for over a decade. Back in 1913, a German chemist named Friedrich Bergius developed a process that could force liquid fuel directly out of coal using extreme heat and pressure. It worked, it just wasn't economical. Not with cheap crude oil flooding in from newly discovered fields in Oklahoma and Texas. For years, nobody needed it. Then the Nazi government adopted a formal synthetic fuel program in 1936, and suddenly that same uneconomical chemistry became a matter of national survival. By July 1938, at a planning meeting held at Hermann Göring's own country estate, priority construction orders went out for hydrogenation plants, factories built specifically to run the Bergius process at industrial scale. The numbers moved fast after that. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, 14 hydrogenation plants were already running, with 6 more under construction. By 1940, those plants alone were producing over 72,000 barrels a day, 46% of Germany's entire oil supply. And for the one branch of the military that couldn't function without it, the numbers were even more stark. This single chemical process was supplying up to 95% of the fuel, keeping German aircraft in the sky. A decade-old, commercially abandoned invention had just become the thing keeping the Luftwaffe airborne. But scaling a laboratory process into 14 working factories in under 3 years doesn't happen through German engineering alone. It requires resources, expertise, and money on a scale that only a handful of companies on Earth could actually provide. December 2, 1925, Frankfurt, Germany. 6 of the largest chemical manufacturers in the country, including names you'd still recognize today, BASF, Bayer, and Hoechst, formally merge into a single entity. The new company takes the name IG Farben, and almost overnight it becomes the largest chemical concern not just in Germany, but on the entire planet. This wasn't a friendly partnership. It was a cartel, in the literal sense. Competitors combining specifically to control pricing, dominate research, and crush anyone smaller who tried to compete. By the early 1930s, IG Farben held an almost unimaginable trove of chemical patents, and wielded more economic weight than most of the individual nations it operated inside. Then came 1929. The Wall Street crash didn't stay in America. It tore through a German economy already leaning heavily on US loans. Unemployment exploded. Industrial output collapsed by half. Even IG Farben's stock cratered, and the company's enormous bet on synthetic fuel research suddenly looked like it might sink the entire enterprise. A company that powerful, staring down collapse, needed a protector. In January 1933, it found one. Hitler became chancellor, and within weeks, IG Farben executives were meeting with the new regime directly, funding the Nazi Party's operations in exchange for guaranteed state contracts on exactly the technology the company was desperate to keep funded. But there was still a gap IG Farben couldn't close on its own. The high-pressure engineering the Bergius process demanded at industrial scale kept running into metallurgical problems nobody in Germany had fully solved. The solution to that problem already existed. It just belonged to somebody else, on the other side of the Atlantic. Let's go back further. Back before the Depression. Back before Hitler was anyone outside a Munich beer hall. Because this part of the story starts as something almost boring. Just business. By the mid-1920s, Standard Oil of New Jersey sat at the absolute top of the global oil industry. John D. Rockefeller's empire, still dominant decades after he built it. And Standard Oil had a problem that had nothing to do with running out of oil. It had everything to do with a German chemical process that suddenly made crude oil refining look primitive. Standard's president, Walter Teagle, didn't fly to Germany because he wanted to help Germany make fuel from coal. He went because he realized the same high-pressure hydrogenation science could crack more high-value gasoline out of every single barrel of crude Standard Oil was already pumping out of American ground. That single insight led to one of the most consequential industrial agreements of the century. In 1929, the two companies signed the deal. Standard Oil handed over a block of its own stock, worth $35 million, well over $500 million today. In exchange, IG Farben transferred the exclusive rights to its hydrogenation technology, outside of Germany, into a new jointly owned company, Standard EG Company. Standard Oil held roughly 80% of it. At the time, nobody involved was thinking about tanks or aircraft. This was viewed almost entirely as a commercial licensing agreement, two industrial giants trading what each other needed. That would not stay true for long. 1933. Hitler takes power. And overnight, a purely commercial licensing deal starts carrying weight neither company could have predicted when they signed it. Every improvement German engineers made to the hydrogenation process wasn't just a scientific advance anymore, it was military infrastructure. And fuel wasn't Germany's only vulnerability tied into this same web of chemistry. There was a second one, just as dangerous. Rubber. No rubber means no tires, no aircraft landing gear, no tank seals. An army simply doesn't move without it. IG Farben had already developed a synthetic rubber process built on the same underlying chemistry as the fuel technology. The patents, the research relationships, the entire technical partnership with Standard Oil, all of it now touched two separate pillars of German war capability at once. In 1936, the Nazi government formalized this urgency into policy. The 4-year plan, an economic sprint with one explicit goal: total war readiness within 48 months. Hitler placed Hermann Göring in direct control. German planners weren't improvising this out of paranoia, they were haunted by a specific memory. In the First World War, a British naval blockade had strangled German imports and exposed exactly how fragile the country became once foreign supply lines vanished. They weren't going to let it happen twice, and their fear turned out to be justified almost immediately. The moment the Anglo-French blockade dropped in September 1939, Germany's access to foreign oil imports disappeared virtually overnight. By then, though, the hydrogenation plants were already running. Between 1936 and 1939, Germany had pushed its own synthetic output to cover roughly a third of its total oil needs, all while quietly stockpiling a reserve on the side. That reserve fit precisely into the military strategy being built around it. Blitzkrieg, the fast, overwhelming campaign, burns far less fuel than a prolonged war of attrition. If Germany could win quickly enough, the reserve might last exactly long enough to matter. A business deal signed in 1929 between two companies with no interest in European politics had become one of the load-bearing pillars of a war Hitler hadn't even declared yet, which leaves one uncomfortable question hanging over everything that came next. Why did an American corporation stay this deeply tied to German industry years after the direction Germany was heading became impossible to ignore? The easy answer is profit, and profit was real. But it isn't the whole answer, because underneath this one deal sat a genuine split in how America's most powerful financial interests viewed Europe in the 1930s. On one side, the Morgan banking empire, for decades closely tied to Britain and France, having helped finance the Allied war effort in World War I. As a second European conflict loomed, Morgan interests largely viewed the rise of fascism as a direct threat to a financial order anchored in London and Paris. Rockefeller's fortune came from a completely different place: oil, not banking, and Standard Oil's international business relationships, including the one with IG Farben, had been built years before Hitler held any real power at all. Those agreements simply stayed in place as Europe's politics deteriorated around them. That split is still debated by historians today, whether it reflected competing commercial interests inside American finance itself, or something closer to genuine ideological difference. One more distinction gets lost in this story constantly, and it's worth being precise about. Standard Oil and the Rockefeller Foundation were not the same organization, chasing the same goals. While Standard Oil kept its commercial ties to German industry intact, the Rockefeller Foundation ran in the opposite direction entirely. In 1933, it created a refugee scholar program that helped academics dismissed or persecuted under the Nazi regime, many of them Jewish, escape and continue their work abroad. Same family name, genuinely different missions. But the public rarely made that distinction, and the longer the Standard Oil Agreement stayed in force, the harder that distinction became to explain. As America edged closer to entering the war outright, yesterday's ordinary business decisions were about to be measured against an entirely different standard. By 1942, there was no more ambiguity to hide behind. America was officially at war, Germany was officially the enemy, and every pre-war corporate relationship with German industry was suddenly under a microscope in Washington. Congress opened an investigation. Federal officials dug into Standard Oil's patent agreements with IG Farben, and one deal in particular drew intense scrutiny: an attempt to move roughly $24 million in Hungarian assets, in gold, worth well over $500 million today. The U.S. Treasury stepped in and blocked it outright. Investigators dug further and found something worse. Internal correspondence showed IG Farben had transferred roughly 2,000 foreign patents to Standard Oil, and that both companies had discussed keeping parts of that relationship alive, even if the United States entered the war against Germany directly. On March 25, 1942, rather than face a criminal trial in the middle of a world war, Standard Oil's leadership signed a consent decree. They pleaded no contest to criminal conspiracy charges, paid a $50,000 fine, and surrendered their synthetic rubber patents to the U.S. war production effort. The company framed it as a practical decision. A trial would have cost months of its executives' time when the country needed their war work more. The Senate's Truman Committee did not frame it that way at all. Committee Chairman Harry Truman, years before he became president, reviewed the same documents, the same wartime correspondence, the same 1939 agreement to keep the relationship alive, even in the event of war. His word for what he found? Treasonable. Both of these things are true at once. Standard Oil's public defense, that this began as ordinary commercial licensing, years before the war, under a legal framework nobody had reason to view as dangerous at the time, genuinely holds up as far as it goes. And the documented evidence that the arrangement was deliberately preserved after the two countries became enemies is also real, sitting in the same Senate record, under the same chairman's signature. A business deal signed in 1929 to improve gasoline yields from Texas crude had ended, 13 years later, with a sitting U.S. senator publicly accusing one of America's largest corporations of siding with the enemy. I'm not going to tell you which framing is the fair one. The documents support pieces of both. But the next time you hear that a war was fought purely between nations, remember this. Some of the chemistry that kept Hitler's Air Force flying traced back through a research agreement, a corporate stock transfer, and a handshake in New Jersey. It was never really just about the fuel.